I believe that everyone else has already talked about what I was going to talk about, so I'll be very, very quick. But I'll just talk about climate litigation updates. I'm from the London School of Economics Grantham Research Institute, and I'm filling in for Jameela Joy. So we know that there are many, many cases currently. This started actually as a policy brief in 2017, and now every year, Joanna Setzer and Catherine Hyam have been releasing this global trend snapshot. And it's quite funny because now it's more than just a snapshot, it's actually a really, really long piece of document. And we define climate litigation as those cases that are brought before judicial and quasi-judicial bodies that involve material issues of climate change, science, policy, or law. And this came about because most of this climate litigation stuff have been a response to political failures, say, in the negotiations. Things are going quite slow in the negotiations, and so some people are going to their courts in order to have their rights recognized. Most of this are in order to hold their governments and corporations responsible. And I was telling Rainer yesterday, most of this is not so much about all the conversations on health, but rather about changing narrative, creating a broader discourse, a public discourse on what is needed in the global south and by plaintiffs. It's also used to push financial markets away from fossil fuels and then going back to creating pressure for political solutions. So the negotiations as well as litigation always go hand in hand. This is just a very brief overview of what's been happening since the late 1980s. We know that there's been an uptick since the Paris Agreement in 2015, and as of writing, there are around 3,000 climate cases, with around 200 cases filed just in 2024. And we have seen a phase of dynamic growth in the global south, particularly during the start of the nationally determined contributions, where 60% of cases have been filed in the global south. And if you see here, much of the cases still remain with the United States, but currently there are more cases in Brazil, in Asia as well. So there are many different types of cases. I won't go through all of them. I think the most that we know are the things that were mentioned as well by Professor Willer earlier. We have government framework cases, for instance, where plaintiffs file cases against their governments for their non-ambitious goals, their NDCs, for instance, or their national legislation. We have corporate framework cases, which is the same thing, but for corporations, whether their policies, their regulations are in line with the temperature goals. And we also have polluter pays cases or the climate damages cases, which include the case of RWE, or Liuya versus RWE. But there are many, many other types of cases, including, I think this is really interesting, turning on the taps, which are cases filed against financiers. So currently there's the case of Milieu Defensive versus ING Bank, and their call is that ING or other financiers stop financing fossil fuel companies. So there's a really, really broad discussion, and many of them are called strategic litigation. In the context of our conversation today, and this was also already referred to by Professor Weller earlier, that climate change is a health issue. And there are plenty of litigation currently that are challenging litigation as well as policies that are not good for health. For instance, in South Africa, the Council Coal case and Australia's Sharma versus Minister for Environment were litigation that challenged specific projects for the threat to health and well-being. And the plaintiffs in this case were both children, youth. They were saying that climate change was an intergenerational issue and their rights as children would be impeded because of future coal-fired power plants. There is also, on the other hand, on the other side of the intertemporality of climate change as a health issue is the case of Klimaseniorinnen versus Switzerland, which is a group of senior women who filed a case initially in Switzerland court and then later in the European Court of Human Rights, saying that their mortality and morbidity rates were impacted because of climate change. And this was resolved in their favor, although implementation is a different story altogether. There's also the new case of Thales versus Total Energies. It is known as the Belgian farmer case, where he is from Wallonia and has filed a case against Total Energies for their contribution to the droughts that took place in 2020, 2022, and 2018. And he mentioned eco-anxiety as part of his pleadings. This has also been mentioned by other US cases. And finally, as mentioned by Professor Weller, the ICJ advisory opinion is very, very important because it did mention the role of health, as well as it made mention or made reference to the International Convention on Economic, Civil, Social Rights, where the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest physical standard of physical and mental health will be affected by climate change. So just finishing off with my brief intervention, litigation based on health is still underused by the Global South. As I said earlier, many of the cases I mentioned were based in the Global North, and this is because of many, many issues, including, for instance, technical access and financial assistance. There is scarcity of evidence, and courts normally would want things that scientists don't really produce. So there's a need for scientists and lawyers to talk, to come together, as well as campaigners, health practitioners. This needs to be a whole of society approach so that those, especially from the Global South, can be able to achieve climate justice. Currently, many of the cases from the Global South are from Global South plaintiffs filing a case against Global North entities. So we have, for instance, this case of Asmania versus Holcim, which is a group of residents in Peri Island in Indonesia filing a case against Holcim, which is in Switzerland. We also have the newly launched case of the typhoon survivors of Odette versus Shell, where typhoon survivors of Typhoon Rai in the Philippines in 2021 are filing a case against Shell. And this is because of many issues such as, for instance, availability of evidence. And perhaps this is why this conversation is really important. We need health practitioners, scientists, lawyers to be in the same room so that what is presented in evidence in court is what is needed by the judge to make an assessment. We were talking yesterday about how sometimes the most compelling cases, the cases that are won are not necessarily the ones with the most compelling evidence, but the ones that are most understood by judges. So scientists need to be able to talk to lawyers so that the evidence presented by lawyers will also be in line with, but also understood by science as well as law. And one of our projects is called Bridging the Evidentiary Gap. We hold workshops with scientists, lawyers, practitioners, in order to create an interconnection, an interrelation between all of these sectors in order to meet our goal of climate justice. Thank you.